Ramses the Great is known for carving his face in colossal proportions, crushing empires, and ruling Egypt with an iron fist for almost 7 decades. Official history crowns a pharaoh with an ego as relentless as the desert itself, a leader who demanded absolute submission. But there is a disturbing detail buried in the dead silence of the Valley of the Queens, a monument that shatters this unbreakable image. The tomb, catalogued as QV6, hides the record of a man who was completely brought to his knees, utterly consumed by his obsession for a single woman. While other queens languished in modest graves, the pharaoh drained the empire's treasury to build the most insane, exorbitant sepulchre ever discovered by modern archaeology. What lies beneath those ancient seals isn't just millennia-old art, but the hard proof of a political secret and a passion that literally shifted the gears of the ancient world. Traditional history, the kind we usually flip through in standard textbooks, often makes the gross mistake of reducing the great queens of ancient Egypt to mere window dressing, treating them as luxury pawns on a massive, cold chessboard of political alliances and dynastic marriages. Overwhelmingly, they existed only in the colossal shadow of their husbands, confined to bearing heirs while playing the uncomfortable role of silent supporting cast members in the official court. But Nefertari flipped that script with devastating force, breaking absolutely every rule, expectation, and protocol of submissiveness in the enigmatic 19th dynasty. And to truly grasp the political weight and tremendous importance of this woman, we don't need to rely on mere speculation. We just need to look closely at the stone walls that have survived almost intact for over 3,200 years, staring down relentless sandstorms, ruthless tomb raiders, and the suffocating grip of time. Within that darkness lay a detail that would radically change everything academia thought it knew about power in Egypt. When modern science and leading Egyptologists finally decoded what was hidden and painted inside, it became undeniably clear that Nefertari's tomb was far from just royal vanity or a passing pharaonic whim. What archaeology unearthed was a monumental, obscenely expensive, and meticulously calculated operation for immortality. What we are going to do here today is a true historical and archaeological autopsy of the most outrageously luxurious tomb ever seen on Egyptian soil. We'll dive deep into a documentary analysis of how a warrior pharaoh, a man whose mind and soul were forged in ruthless military campaigns, deliberately shifted the spotlight from his own glories and used the staggering wealth of his empire to guarantee his favorite wife was elevated to the status of a living goddess. Have you ever stopped to think about the absurd level of influence it takes to make the most feared ruler on earth bend the economy and religion of an entire empire just to immortalize you? And before we walk down those heavy stone steps together into the breathtaking corridors of the Valley of the Queens, I have a very special invitation. If you love diving into deep, real-world investigations, the kind that rewrite everything we thought we knew, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel right now so you don't miss our next travels through time. And since I make it a point to know the fantastic people walking side by side with me through these stories, head down to the comments real quick and drop your name and your age. I really want to know who makes up our community of curious minds. When we start our descent down those heavy limestone steps into the depths of the Valley of the Queens, the natural expectation is to find the pitch-black darkness and deathly silence of a historical mausoleum. But in 1904, veteran Italian Egyptologist Ernesto Schiaparelli came face to face with something that completely defied all archaeological logic up to that point. When he breached the entrance of the structure we now catalog as the enigmatic tomb QV6, he didn't just find a dusty burial chamber, He swung open those heavy stone doors to what the modern world would rightfully call the Sistine Chapel of ancient Egypt. And you can rest assured that comparison isn't just romantic literary flair, but a heavy, technical, and artistic realization that leaves researchers and historians completely stunned to this very day. The breathtaking architecture of this subterranean space shatters the rules and all established standards for ancient Egyptian funerary construction. Unlike other documented tombs, where paintings were often slapped roughly and directly onto the raw rock, the massive ceilings and walls of Nefertari's sepulchre were meticulously coated in a thick layer of high-quality stucco. It was this perfectly smooth canvas that received plaster bas-reliefs, carved by master artisans with a precision bordering on the surgical. Every stroke, every hieroglyph, and every tiny fold in the queen's painted garments was sculpted with obsessive detail. They weren't just aiming for the aesthetic beauty of a standard piece of art, but the strict, necessary religious exactness to guarantee a ruler's safe passage straight into eternity. But what truly steals the breath from anyone bold enough to walk those ancient corridors is the almost violent, uninterrupted explosion of color. Can you imagine the psychological shock of walking through a shadow-drenched cave in the heart of the desert, only to suddenly be visually crushed by an ocean of absurdly vibrant tones? Ramesses II issued crystal-clear orders that his builders were not to spare a single dime on the execution of the project. To pull it off, they used incredibly rare, astronomically expensive pigments and complex materials extracted at a human and financial cost that is truly incalculable. We are talking about absolute fortunes ground into dust to create the deep lapis lazuli blues of the starry ceiling, gleaming golds that mirrored the majesty and energy of the sun, and striking reds that pulsed with the firm promise of life after death. It's a chromatic richness so intense that the walls look like they were painted just yesterday afternoon. And pay close attention here. These colors weren't splashed up there on a decorative whim. They formed an incredibly complex visual labyrinth, heavily charged with ancient magic, narrating step-by-step Nefertari's perilous journey into the afterlife, guided closely by fundamental deities of Egyptian mythology, like Hathor and Osiris, through powerful incantations pulled directly from the Book of the Dead. That dazzling art acted as cutting-edge spiritual technology, funded without limits by the pharaoh's bottomless vaults. The undeniable fact is that Ramses wasn't just decorating his wife's final resting place. He was building, stone by stone and color by color, an impenetrable spiritual trench, meticulously designed to bulletproof her soul and her name against the brutal erasure of history. It was precisely by absorbing this technical and visual flex that modern science grasped the true gravity of the political landscape of that era. Tomb QV6 proved to be the glaring material testimony of a ruthless military leader who mobilized the greatest and most expensive talents of his time entirely to honor Nefertari. But there was an even more staggering outlier. Beyond that painted, protected bubble, there was a breach of military protocol so heretical and scandalous, built under the blinding desert sun hundreds of miles away, that it would completely rewrite what we know about the rigid Egyptian hierarchy of power. And it is exactly this overwhelming architectural heresy that we are going to look at right now. To truly understand the absolute anomaly that was Nefertari's life, we have to leave the colorful, silent depths of the Valley of the Queens and face the scorching sun of the Nubian desert, way down in the extreme south of Egypt. That is where, carved directly into the solid rock of an ancient mountain, rests the towering complex of Abu Simbel. If the breathtaking tomb QV6 was a non-negotiable guarantee of immortality in the underworld, Abu Simbel was Ramses II's political megaphone, screaming his relentless military might to intimidate neighboring nations. But There was a detail in this monumental build that practically short-circuited the political and religious elite of the time. A break in protocol so brutal and outrageous that, to this day, top-tier Egyptologists and historians wonder how the pharaoh managed to greenlight something so heretical without facing a massive rebellion from the traditional clergy. To understand the real weight of this, we need to remember an absolute unbreakable golden rule of ancient Egyptian art: the rigid hierarchy of scale. Back in those ancient times, the size of a figure on a public monument had absolutely nothing to do with their actual physical height, but rather their level of cosmic, military, and political importance. The pharaoh, being the living sacred bridge between sovereign gods and mortal men, was always depicted as a relentless, towering giant. Meanwhile, his wives, no matter how highly esteemed, along with his own children and war generals, were carved as mere miniatures, almost like living ornaments that, at best, barely reached the monarch's knees. It was a fast, visual, undeniable way of telling the world exactly who ran the show. This wasn't just modern-style sexism. It was pure government theological propaganda firing on all cylinders. The pharaoh was the gravitational center of the Egyptian universe, and everyone else simply orbited in his shadow. But when we look at the awe-inspiring facade of the smaller temple at Abu Simbel, officially dedicated to the goddess Hathor and the queen consort herself, the historical narrative takes a dizzying jolt. Ramesses II, the supreme ruler who considered himself the living incarnation of the sun god, simply took the millennia-old royal rulebook and threw it out the window. On that monumental limestone facade, there are 6 colossal statues carved into the hard rock, 4 of Ramses and 2 of Nefertari. And this is exactly where the magic, or rather, the scandalous visual heresy, undeniably happens. Nefertari's statues aren't shrinking in subservience near her husband's thick legs. They were carved to the exact same scale as the pharaoh's, towering over 30 feet high, looking eye to eye out over the vast horizon and at any enemy army that dared to sail down the turbulent waters of the Great Nile River. Do you have any idea what this image represented in the harsh geopolitical landscape of the ancient world? By putting Nefertari on the exact same monumental scale as himself, Ramses wasn't just making a sweet, gigantic declaration of love from a completely whipped husband. He was actually sending an absurdly heavy, lethal, and non-negotiable political warning to the central court in Thebes, to the influential priests of Amun, and especially to the cunning leaders of rival empires. The message was sharp and crystal clear. Nefertari wasn't just a beautiful, high-status consort. She was his official divine counterpart, a hands-on co-ruler, and a flesh-and-blood goddess walking sovereign across the Egyptian sands. It was a true masterstroke that elevated the queen to a status of equality that very few women in the entire history of antiquity would ever even glimpse. The top brass military command and the Egyptian intellectual elite surely had to swallow hard when they witnessed this absurd equalization of power carved in stone. Ramses's unspoken warning left no room for doubt or conspiracies. Plotting against her was the exact same thing as pulling a sword on his own chest. If you happen to think this majestic, untouchable goddess status was just there to stroke the queen's vanity, or to make her look good during exhausting state ceremonies, prepare to rethink everything you thought you knew. Because what archaeology and deep documentary analysis later uncovered proved that Nefertari wielded a diplomatic weight that was truly terrifying. And this completely shifts the course of our story, because she knew how to cash in on all that unprecedented prestige to move, with absolute mastery and cold calculation, the heaviest pieces on the international chessboard, while her husband handled the front lines. If the colossal facade of Abu Simbel served to rub Nefertari's undeniable divine status in the face of Egyptian society, It's right in the cold, behind-the-scenes geopolitics of the ancient world that we find the true scope of her power. It's incredibly easy, and honestly a bit lazy, to look back at the distant past and reduce this fantastic woman to the mere role of a muse, imagining a docile wife living comfortably in the shadows of the royal palace harems. But that romantic, shallow narrative collapses instantly the second we cross the borders of modern archaeology and analyze hard historical data and documents. What the records show us with crystal clarity is that Nefertari operated in the shadows as a bona fide head of state and a brilliant international strategist, moving the heavy machinery of Egyptian foreign policy with a technical precision that would leave the pharaoh's most seasoned generals absolutely speechless. To fully grasp the sheer diplomatic genius of this queen, we need to focus on the bloody aftermath of the Battle of Kadesh. Ramses had marched his relentless legions into a violent head-on collision with the dreaded Hittite Empire. It was an epic bloodbath in the trenches that ended in a bloody technical tie, even though the pharaoh's rigorous propaganda machine screamed of his glorious victory from the rooftops. The undeniable fact was that Egypt and Hatti, the two greatest superpowers of the era, were plunged into a grueling, incredibly expensive Cold War. And it was exactly in this volatile landscape where a single spark in the desert could detonate a massive new bloodbath that Nefertari stepped onto the field to resolve through diplomacy what the brute force and inflated egos of the armies had utterly failed to fix. And it was right then that archaeology made one of the most vital discoveries of the last century, far from the scorching sands of Egypt, way up in the ancient ruins of Hattusa, the impenetrable Hittite capital. While excavating the royal archives, researchers stumbled upon the so-called Bogazkoy archives, a precious batch of diplomatic correspondence exchanged directly between Nefertari and the powerful Hittite queen, Puduhepa. We aren't talking about sweet little notes or court gossip here. These were rigorous, official state documents drafted in Akkadian, the international diplomatic language of the day. Through these heavy clay tablets, Nefertari ran a highly complex web of negotiations. She deployed all her razor-sharp charisma, sending carefully calculated and outrageously expensive gifts, like solid gold and rare fabrics, all while her words, carved in clay, revealed a laser-focused dealmaker who knew exactly how to dismantle the defenses of a fierce enemy nation. In one of the most iconic tablets that survived the test of time, the Egyptian queen writes to Puduhepa with calculated intimacy and masterful diplomacy, breaking the ice by affectionately calling her "my sister," and wishing deep peace upon her people and her lands. Extremely subtly, she built the complex foundations of mutual trust there, something the armed men on the front lines, blinded by military honor and pride, were simply incapable of establishing. And this completely changes what we know about the power dynamics in ancient Egypt, as it becomes irrefutable that Ramses trusted his life and the financial destiny of his empire to his wife's razor-sharp political instincts. Thanks to this flawless, silent work behind the scenes, the two great nations managed to sit down at the table and seal the legendary Treaty of Kadesh, the very first documented, definitive peace and non-aggression treaty in all of human history. Nefertari's mind proved to be just as lethal as the gleaming bronze swords wielded by her husband's army, securing decades of economic stability and monumental glory. She wasn't just the favorite wife, she was the invisible architect of a golden age. However, all that undeniable political prestige wasn't enough to protect her from a devastating attack after her death. And it's as we cross the dark thresholds of her tomb in the Valley of the Queens that we run headfirst into a dark, deeply disturbing archaeological mystery. Despite all the grandeur and near-divine respect Nefertari commanded in life, the diplomatic firepower of Abu Simbel wasn't enough to shield her from the grim terror awaiting her physical body. When we step through the doorways of her tomb and reach the main burial chamber, the glorious narrative of Ramses takes a brutal hit. The discovery made by Egyptologist Ernesto Schiaparelli in 1904 revealed one of archaeology's greatest mysteries and tragedies. The flawless beauty of the brightly painted walls contrasted in a sickening way with the scene of utter devastation and extreme sadism that stained the floor of the sepulchre. The problem is that the absurd wealth deposited there by Ramses II acted like a lethal magnet for ancient tomb raiders. When the Egyptologists lit up the center of the room with torches, they didn't find the queen resting in peace. The majestic red granite sarcophagus, carved to withstand the end of days, was shattered, scattered across the floor in pieces, like the target of a blind, furious hatred. But there was a much more macabre detail in that rubble. The thieves, in their sick rush to rip the amulets from the linen wrappings, simply tore the queen's mummy apart without an ounce of remorse. The woman who had sat at the table with the world's great empires had her body ripped to shreds by common thugs. And it was in that moment that the shock of the discovery turned into a deep, heavy melancholy for the research team. Because all that was supposed to be left of the woman considered the most powerful and beautiful in Egypt, the only human pieces recovered from that overturned earth were a pair of mummified legs, specifically her knees. It is a terribly poetic and heartbreaking image. The queen, who walked side by side with the most megalomaniacal pharaoh in history, suddenly reduced to fragmented knees, forgotten on the cold floor of the Valley of the Queens. For decades, science wrestled with an agonizing question. Did those dried-out bones actually belong to the legendary Nefertari? Or were they just the remains of someone else, tossed in there during later invasions? To try and solve this unsettling forensic mystery, modern science stepped in. An international team ran those knees through a rigorous battery of high-tech exams, including radiocarbon dating, anthropological analysis, and detailed X-rays. The results were staggering and pointed out that the legs belonged to a woman who died around the age of 40 to 50, whose height and bone structure perfectly matched the physical records of Nefertari. All the evidence pointed to the same definitive answer. Science was staring at what was left of Ramses's great love. And this completely changes how we feel when we look at the lavishness of Tomb QV6, the most luxurious, expensive, and artistically perfect space the Egyptian empire ever built utterly failed in its primary mission. The undeniable magic of the colors brilliantly protected her memory for eternity. But the stone engineering couldn't bulletproof its owner's physical body. It is a cutting irony to realize that the most powerful man on earth couldn't save the woman he loved from the sheer greed and avarice of the living. This devastating failure, however, seems to have left incredibly deep, unhealable scars on Ramses's soul, marking a brutal psychological turning point in his long reign. And it is exactly this silent pain, carved into the stone, that we are going to investigate in our next stage. That deep, silent pain left behind by the desecration of Nefertari's body brings us to the most human, devastating aspect of this entire archaeological journey. When the man who ruled the ancient world lost his consort, something broke irreparably inside the mind of the great pharaoh. We usually picture Ramses II as an unstoppable war machine, a strategist who had his own muscles carved in granite just to intimidate nations. But there was a detail on the walls of Tomb QV6 that completely deconstructs that stone-cold image, revealing a psychological vulnerability that the history books rarely mention. In there, surrounded by that explosion of colors and magical protection rituals, Ramses deliberately dropped his heavy military titles to take on the role of a man in deep mourning. Writing what we can only classify as pure poetry, carved into the rock. And that was the moment Egyptologists realized they weren't just reading cold spells from the Book of the Dead, but rather the final words of a husband, desperately trying to hold on to the memory of the woman he loved. Among the many hieroglyphic inscriptions drawn under the torchlight, there is one particular phrase that transcends time and absolutely shocks you with its raw, passionate beauty. The pharaoh, who truly believed he was the living incarnation of the gods, had this declaration carved for all eternity. "Just by passing, she has stolen away my heart. She is the one for whom the sun shines." Can you even measure the impact of that? The supreme leader who dictated the fate of millions of people, openly confessing that his own light depended entirely on the existence of this one woman. The tragic truth is that after Nefertari's death, the tone of Ramses's long reign changed drastically. He kept ruling for decades, and he had other wives. But the undeniable truth is that no other woman ever managed to reach even a fraction of that absurd level of political influence and monumental spotlight. The pharaoh kept raising temples across Egypt, but he never again committed the heresy of putting another person on that exact same scale of equality. Nefertari's absence created a power vacuum that nobody else could fill. And that completely flips what we know about the coldness of ancient rulers, proving that behind the machinery of a colossal empire, there was a shattered man who used the heaviest stones in the desert in a desperate bid to materialize his pain forever. When we stop and look back at this whole journey, from the colossal facade of Abu Simbel down to the silent, wildly colorful walls of the Valley of the Queens, it becomes absolutely clear that Nefertari's tomb was never meant to be just a standard grave. In reality, that underground labyrinth was the greatest, most daring declaration of war Ramses II ever made. And this time, it was a war against oblivion. The pharaoh, who was used to bringing entire empires to their knees by the sheer ruthless force of his sword, tried to bend the inflexible laws of time and religion themselves, just to ensure that his obsession and devotion to this woman wouldn't simply vanish in the agonizing moment of death. He wasn't just burying a queen. He was architecting immortality in a place where even the greatest rulers usually turn to dust. And it's fascinating to see how fate worked in such a mysterious, almost ironic way over the millennia. The vast ocean of desert sand, the same sand that wipes entire civilizations off the map, ended up tirelessly burying the entrance to the tomb for thousands of years. That heavy, natural curtain acted like armored plating, sealing off the environment and creating an untouchable microclimate that protected those rare pigments and ancient spells from certain destruction. We obviously can't ignore the tragedy of it all. Tomb raiders desecrated the ruler's rest, stole all the gold, tore the mummy apart, and left behind a sadistic crime scene. However, if we look closely at the core beliefs of that era, we realize that the pharaoh's original master plan was majestically fulfilled. To ancient Egyptian society, a final, unbeatable death only happened the moment someone's name stopped being spoken by the living. And looking at it through that lens, Ramses won by a landslide. More than 3,200 years after the heavy doors of that tomb were sealed for the very last time. Nefertari's breathtaking beauty, her sacred name, and her immense political weight remain perfectly alive and intact beneath the rock. We are still studying her brilliant diplomatic moves, and we still stand in awe of her divinity. That titanic undertaking, cemented as the most luxurious monument in Egypt, proved that the power and the love of an emperor actually managed to break through the dreaded barrier of eternity. As we seal the doors on yet another staggering chapter of human history, we are left with the hard proof that the past always holds deep secrets for anyone willing to look past the simplistic narratives. If this silent expedition through the mind of the greatest pharaoh and the tomb of his grand obsession changed the way you see the ancient world, don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel to support our investigative work, and share this documentary with anyone else who is passionate about the mysteries of our civilization. A big hug. Thank you so much for riding along with me, and I'll see you on our next journey through time.